Well, I have managed to squeeze in a couple of things from last year that I never got around to. The first of which, Furiosa. I was frustrated that I missed this in the theater because I knew it was going to look amazing on the big screen. And it looked pretty good on the small screen, mostly. There's one aspect that I'll kind of come back to. But, oh boy, I would have loved to have seen this on the big screen. I'd heard kind of mixed things about this. And it was hard to parse what people's issues were. I think people were expecting, well, something a little bit more propellant, something a little bit more kind of chase fueled like Fury Road was. And this isn't really that. While still very much undeniably being a Mad Max wasteland kind of story. It fits that world for sure, and it's got George Miller's fingerprints all over it as a writer and director. But it is doing something different. I like this a lot. I'd actually say this might be one of the most intelligently put together prequels that I can think of. Because prequels in general have a number of inherent problems. The first is predeterminism. We know where characters have to end up. They have to end up in whatever situation they were at the start of the thing that this is a prequel to. So that means any characters who are in that, who show up in the prequel, we know can't die. And if we initially see them in a state that doesn't match how we know they started the next one, we know at least one kind of thing that has to happen to them. Example from this very movie, Furiosa starts out with both her arms. And we know she only has one in Fury Road. So obviously she's going to lose her arm at some point. So there's that kind of predeterminism. But it also affects all the characters who don't show up in the thing that it's a prequel to. Because it means that they're either going to die or be unimportant. Because either they don't survive to show up in the thing that it's a prequel to, or they don't matter to that story, which makes it harder to invest in them in this one. These are some of the kind of inherent problems, but then there's that's kind of built-in issues. Then there's the traps that prequel makers get, which is what I'm just going to call box checking. It's like they sat down thinking about the character or the space or, whatever it is that's going to be repeating and going through a checklist of what's a bunch of questions we can answer about them. Whether they were things people actually cared about or were curious about or not. The example of this is Solo, a Star Wars story, which not only is a movie nobody really asked for, decided within a single movie that has a pretty short time span to cover Han's origins in terms of where he came from, how he got into smuggling, how he got the Millennium Falcon, how he met Chewie, how he met Lando, how he got his gun, I think how he got his vest, if I'm remembering the dang thing correctly, and how he learned to shoot first. Oh, and also like the dice that are in literally one shot of the original film. None of this matters. Oh, and let's cover the Kessel Run, which had a throwaway line reference as well. There we go. And let's imply at the end of it that he's about to start working for Jabba the Hutt, which we know he starts doing eventually. Like, it's just a list of checkboxes. And when you have a list of checkboxes and you're trying to create a story that hits all those checkboxes, guess what? You end up with a lousy story that's just a connecting element between hitting all the checkboxes, which are things that were not intended to fill the same space in a story. These are the standard issues with prequels. Some of them are a little bit unavoidable, like with the issue I mentioned with, characters we either know how they end up or we know that they're either going to end up dead or don't matter. That's kind of unavoidable. There are things you can do to minimize and mitigate how much that matters, but that's kind of unavoidable. But then there's the avoidable trap that so many things still fall into regardless. And this avoids almost all of them, despite not actually having no items off checklists. There's a handful of things in this that you could argue is checklist storytelling. Because what do we know about Furiosa in Fury Road? When she was younger, she came from a green place with what seemed to be a matriarchal society. She was taken from there. We know that she ends up in service to Immortan Joe. We know she ends up driving the war rig. We know she loses an arm. This does indeed cover pretty much all of those. It covers her being taken from the green place where she grew up. It covers her life having to be under Immortan Joe. It covers her learning how to drive, be a mechanic. It covers the building of the original war rig. And yes, it covers her losing her arm. But it never feels like box checking. And I think a lot of it is because this thing allows for a grand scale and scope within Furiosa's life that enables those things to just be things that happen along the way, as opposed to feeling like these things were the point of the movie and it's the connective tissue that's just getting us between all the check boxes. It never feels like that. It just feels like, here's the story we're going to tell. Oh, you know what? While we're doing this, here's a way we could answer that. And it fits the story and it flows. It just feels fundamentally different, even though on paper it's kind of doing the same thing. And the word saga is attached to this. And it's very fitting. Like, this thing is almost 2.5 hours. And it earns that runtime. It covers a lot of time for Furiosa's life. Like, Anya Taylor-Joy plays, Furiosa, younger than Charlize, but still an adult. She doesn't show up for about an hour into the movie. The first hour is a even younger version of Furiosa, who we spend a lot of time with. It's not a quick flashback scene at the front. We watch her go through some stuff. And when we get a time jump, it's when she has settled into kind of a somewhat stable situation, so we can skip ahead and assume things kind of continued on in that vein until we get Anya Taylor-Joy taking over. And that sense of scale, and all centered around her need to survive, the things she does to survive, and her desire for revenge. So let's talk about the villain. So the villain, Chris Hemsworth as Dementus. I like him a lot in this. First of all, you can tell he's having fun, which is always a good thing. But more than that, what I like about Dementus as a villain is it's difficult to try and describe how this kind of villain works. He's not smart. In fact, the issue of him not being smart drives the plot at times, because he'll get control of territory and he knew how to get hold of it, but then he doesn't know how to run it. He just kind of runs it into the ground and creates a whole bunch of new problems. But he's not across the board stupid. He's just clever enough. Not really truly properly smart, but just clever enough to be dangerous. He is just clever enough. He can think just enough on his feet to do something you don't expect someone clearly as foolish as he is to do. And it's a really nice line that it writes with him. And it also makes him a distinctly different villain from Immortan Joe, who does also appear in this. But Dementus is a very different kind of villain from Immortan Joe. And so it's one of the things that helps this not just feel like a retread of Fury Road. Aside from the fact that Fury Road is basically a 2-hour chase movie, this has chase moments and chase aspects, but there's a lot more downtime in this. And it gives the movie, again, while feeling very appropriate to this world and this character, it just gives it a fundamentally different feel from Fury Road, which was just go the whole time. This has more quiet moments. And I think ends up having a distinct essence to it, distinct from Fury Road, and to its benefit. I did mention one thing about the visual effects. I don't know for certain if this has more compositing and or green screen and or other sort of that people weren't really in the place where it looks like the movie's trying to make it look like they were. I don't know if this has more of it than Fury Road. I suspect so, because I know how much on location filming there was in Fury Road was part of what made the production of that a little bit of a nightmare. So I don't necessarily knock them for the change. I'm sure it was much easier to do, but you can tell there's a lot more compositing of actors into the space in this than there was in Fury Road. And it might not bother me were it not for having Fury Road for comparison. I know what it looks like when you didn't have to composite them into the location, and it wasn't this. And I don't want to say that it's bad. It's not, but I did notice. I as is true with Mad Max in general, this is at times violent, brutal. Given the nature of the protagonist, just like as a woman, and because like we don't get a ton of stories like this about women in movies, like we just don't. I think a much better comparison, or at least something we see a lot more, are characters like this in video games. The more recent Tomb Raider games, and how Lara Croft has been portrayed as an example. Ellie from The Last of Us, possibly, and like. There's a tendency to enact a lot of overly brutal and often sexual violence to female protagonists in action and or revenge scenarios, and this is both. They don't really do that here. Like, she goes through hell, don't get me wrong, and there is at times the threat of sexual violence, but it's not something that is forced upon us as an audience to have to endure, which I appreciate, because that's the kind of thing that I would probably label as unnecessary cruelty. Accurate to the setting and the characters involved, sure. Does it enhance the story, and do I want to see it? No, I don't think so at all. And it's not there, which is nice, because this is the kind of story that could very easily have that kind of stuff going on, and it doesn't really, which is just a relief. And I think the other thing that really works for this, and this is the thought I'll kind of end on. What I really mean when I say this is, I think, one of the best put together prequels, is that while it does tell a complete story in terms of a big chunk of Furiosa's life, and also wrapping up the story of her very long-winded desire for revenge against Dementis, it also doesn't really feel like a finished story of her as a character. It feels like maybe there's an ending that comes after this. Because there is. And it's Fury Road. And we've already seen it. So this is another one of the problems that prequels tend to have. They either tend to end on what feels like flat out like a to be continued note, which this doesn't, because it has closure on Dementis. Or it feels like closure in a way that it's like, oh, so like this is fake closure because we know what's about to happen. No, like what it feels like in many ways is a complete story, beginning, middle, end, but also like it only feels like a mostly complete saga of somebody's life. We don't have the last chapter of the saga of her life within this movie, but we do have it overall because it's in Fury Road. Because I would like to think that after the events of Fury Road, Furiosa is done with this kind of adventuring, like this kind of violence. I don't want her ending undone from that, which is also why I'm glad that, as much as I adore Charlize Theron in the role, and I was a little bit hesitant to somebody else play her, I'm actually really glad that we got more about Furiosa without having to undo, negate, or destroy the ending that she had at the end of Fury Road. She gets to keep that. And in my mind, there aren't really any more stories to tell about her, not because she didn't live for a long time after that, but because she found peace. Maybe they fend off raiders every now and then, but the kinds of stuff she endures here and in Fury Road, that part of her life is behind her. This is most of it. Fury Road is the end of it. And I like to think she has a quiet life after that. And I feel like between this and Fury Road, I get a very complete look at the struggle it took for her to get that ending. And I really like it. I really like this a lot. I think if you were to press me on it, I like Fury Road better as a film, but like given my expectations of a prequel, which are low for the record, they are quite low. This is real good. Furiosa, Mad Max Saga. Have you seen it? What did you think about it? Whatever your thoughts are, drop something down in the comments. Let's talk about it. Patreon pays the bills, enables me to do this as my living, even if you can't help me out that way. Like, share, subscribe, mayhaps. Don't worry too much about it, though. We take a relaxed attitude around here, so you can just come on back next time you need a break. And now to thank my highest supporting patrons: Robin Moore, Goddess Elida, Zubin Lafula, Jen, Welsh Wrestling Geeks, Oliver B., Alyssa Pedersen, Movie Turtle, Ulrich Bogdan, Melinda Walters, Auntie Kate 808, Andre, Becky Sparks, Claire Wright, Tracy Scrabbit, Angry Kasparov, Dave Hall, Quite Bearish, Rosalind Bennett, Toku Blahuvian, Adam R.D.L. Taylor, Pal Barabajagal, Mary Mello, Mira G, and Sir Didymus is my favorite. If you want to help me ensure that I can keep these guys fed, as well as the other animals and strange creatures that sometimes occupy my house, check out the rewards on the Patreon. Yeah, hello to you too. Bless you.